Good day, good afternoon. Now you just heard that we're recording this session and this should be announced. We are delighted to have you all here today. We had 33 registered participants on Sunday. We will see how many will turn up. We're 27 now from what I can see. For those who haven't met me, my name is Susanne Salin. I work at Mid-Sweden University in Sweden and at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim in Norway. And I'm one of several co-conveners of this LPD RIG in Balmas. And I would like to start to say a special welcome to our 4 presenters and our discussant today. We are thrilled to have you here. We have the theme for today is Global Perspectives on Leadership Preparation and Development. And this is the first event, and we will let you know more about the second event in May, in the end of this session. So I will just say a few practical matters before I will let the first presenters start. As you heard, we will record this session and we will edit it if we need to in the end, but it will be put on the website. Each presenter will have about 50 minutes for the presentation. And when those 15 minutes are up, I will let each presenter know that it's time to finish. So then you have kind of to wrap things up for 30 seconds or a minute. And after the presentations, we will welcome Professor Qing Gu in as a discussant. And we will end the session with a Q&A. So please write down your questions or reflections, have them for your own, and you can put them in the chat during the session. And we will come back to them in the end of the session. And then we will remind you about the second session in May. So let's start. We have, let's see if I can scroll a little bit more. Let's see. So we have Australia, Chile, the state, US, and Hong Kong, and different researchers that will present the different perspectives. And then we will have Qing Gu as our discussant. So I'm very happy to present our first presenters. Helen Good and Bernie Moreno from Australia, you are welcome. And I will immediately stop sharing so you can start.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, and welcome everyone. I'll just share my screen, and I'm delighted to be able to present today with my colleague, Helen Good. We are at the Faculty of Education. You might have heard of us as the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, but in recent months, we have changed our name and we've become a Faculty of Education again in our 100th year of existence. So, of course, following on the global perspectives on leadership preparation and development, we're here to showcase, I guess, the Australian story, and we've very deliberately decided to add so far, given that we are in constant change, not only in education, but also in educational leadership, and always looking at different ways in which we do things and how we can improve them. I also just want to draw your attention that we also on Twitter, for those all of you who are on Twitter, we have a new Twitter account for our RIG, and so you're welcome to follow that, and of course through our own panelist Twitter accounts as well. Okay, so the way we want to start today is by just kind of saying that our narrative, our story, is really not that different to what is happening around the world, and to some of the, I guess, the way in which leadership preparation and development has evolved from a world perspective. So there are a lot of similarities, and in terms of conceptual, theoretical, evidence-based and practice evidence that we have and perspectives, things are quite similar, as I said, to other contexts. So Australia, from an educational perspective, is very much aware of the importance of leadership in schools, and within that understands and takes on very seriously that despite the most distributed models of schools and of leadership in our schools, the principal and the school leader continues to be the strongest sense of influence and leadership in that sense. Also, from what we know, of course, is that in very, in successful schools, leadership, of course, is a very, very important part of that. So all of that comes to frame as well the fact that we know that particularly in more challenging contexts, some of which in the Australian context look like, things like the geographic locations that we have provide some challenges for our educational context. Migration, diaspora, they have a big impact on what that looks like and how we define challenge. And also, of course, as Gary Crow so eloquently says, if then, as a nation, as a state, as a group of people, researchers, practitioners that are so invested in what it means to be a school leader, then leadership preparation can only or should only receive that much attention as well. Using Tony's Global Perspectives paper in 2018 in our very own Management in Education in Belmas, one of our of course, journals, we've decided to frame some of those changes within educational leadership in Australia through these points that very clearly show as well what are some of the changes that educational leadership and the profession as such has gone through. So the first one, I guess, as the title pretty much suggests, the professionalization of school leaders is something that we've been seeing for a good number of 15, 20 years. So that in itself already gives us a sense that there's an understanding that we're not talking about teachers with extra responsibilities, but it's a completely different way in which we understand these people in schools, and therefore their development and their profession needs to be addressed in a different way. In a couple of next slides, I'll be explaining at a national level how that's been done. So things like the expansion of the role of the school principal, we know not only recently through COVID pandemic, but the way in which we do our work, how we do our research with principals, the work that Helen and I do and our colleagues as well, but also through national surveys that we have on the work of school principals. We have a very clear and sometimes quite alarming evidence of how that expansion of the role is growing in its complexity more than anything. Australia, in terms of devolution of powers to school level, has in the last 30 years given back a lot of autonomy. So in all of the systems, the three systems that we have, which I'll explain in the next slide, school leaders do have a lot of autonomy in the way that they exercise their leadership, in the way that they put together their school improvement plans. And so again, that also adds to the way in which we need to address how these individuals are prepared for the role and the ongoing development that they receive. The increasing complexity, as I said, of school context, and I mentioned that earlier, things like the diaspora, the geographic locations, the reality, for example, of the teacher shortage that we have at the moment creates a very big complexity in our schools. And so that also means that there's a different way in which we have to approach the way that we prepare our individuals in these roles. Of course, the recognition that preparation is a moral obligation. And with that, of course, we know that when there is effective preparation and development, we've got enough evidence to show that it does make a difference. So therefore, it's something that we need to address. To give you a little bit of context, very, very briefly, to those of you that may not be aware. So Australia has three systems. We have government schools, Catholic system, which is very big, and also the independent, which another way of saying the private school systems. Important to mention also that in terms of funding, whilst the in terms of policy and regulations and operations, it's at a state level, the funding is at a national level. And every single school in Australia from all three systems will receive funding as well. 64% of our students attend government schools. However, it is in the last 5 years, there's a very growing, it is the independent sector that is growing the most. So there is a shift there, whilst small, that is growing every year for the last 5 years as well. From a national perspective, and linking back to those points from Tony's paper, there has been an approach to actually look at what are the standards, what are we looking for, what are some of the standards for principals, very much aimed, you will see there with professional practices, you'll identify a lot of the work of Leafwood, of Day, looking at leading teaching and learning, developing self and others, and of course, based by 3 very important standards as well. Something that we could call like principal literacy, together with vision and values, self-leadership, and all underpinned by the leadership context that includes the school, local area, of course, wider community, and Australia and its global position as well. All of that with the aim of being able to impact and influence high quality learning, teaching and learning, and to create successful learners who are confident, creative individuals and active and informed citizens. This is an approach by AITSL, which is our National Australian Institute for Teachers and School Leadership. So this is almost now 10 years old. And just like we have standard for principals, we also have the standards for teachers as well. Together with the standards, a model has been created by AITSL that I'm a bit ironic about it, because I look at it and I think it's just so clean and tidy and neat, and often these things tend to look very linear, where we think that teachers begin their career, where they start thinking about leadership, and then where the actual school leadership preparation takes place. However, we know that that is not necessarily how things happen. For example, this is a slide that we presented as part of our leadership demands on early career teachers, which we presented at ICSI in Dublin. So for some of you, this might be familiar. But the reality is that the way or the trajectory of our school principals in Australia looks a little bit more like this, where we have a sense that from an AITSL perspective, and that's the purple one, we do have some steps of going from classroom teacher to leader only. Middle leaders fits in a little bit there, but that red tends to be much more flexible than what we think. And also the concept of teacher leaders as well, where the question mark says, well, where does it start and where does it end? And it's a contested notion of teacher leadership as well, because there are different ways in which we understand what teacher leadership means. From a Victorian Department of Education perspective, again, it's very different, because that's how we interpret the national standards in Victoria, which is where we live in Melbourne. That, again, looks a little bit more like self-leadership, emergent leadership, looking at then middle leadership and school leadership and system leadership. What we are finding, however, is that middle leadership is extending beyond. And we're also finding that through our research in the leadership demands of early career teachers, that the leadership, the team leadership and the school leadership is starting to come in much earlier in the career of our young teachers. Helen, I'll pass on to you now.
Thank you. So thanks, everyone, and thanks, Bernie, for getting us to this point. So the interesting thing is that we've got the standards, we've got all this, but in the end, how do we prepare as school leaders? Well, nationally, all you need to be a school leader is to have a teaching qualification and a registration with the state teaching body. So each of the states has their own registered body. In Victoria, we call it the Victorian Institute of Teaching. We have no mandatory preparation programs. And I guess in some ways, the best way you would describe our preparation is a bit of an apprentice model. So At the state level, we of course have university award courses, otherwise we'd all be out of a job. But in no way, unlike in the United States, there's no way that they're obligatory. Our students at uni take these up of their own volition. They do have exposure to middle leadership roles, as Bernie was showing in that diagram. But again, there's no set pattern to it. It may happen, it may not. What we do have are a number of aspiring principal programs. So we've rattled off a whole list there of the different acronyms. But basically, they are through principal associations. The max one, as you see, is the Catholic schools in Victoria. The ACEL is our equivalent, I guess, to Belmas. The AISV is what I suppose is for our independent schools, but they are random. Most importantly, they're non-credentialed. And that's one of the challenges, that people pay money, do these courses, but at the end of the day, they're not credentialed. Bernie, can we move on? Thank you. Just as an example, we thought we'd just show you one from the Victorian model, is the VAPA, the Victorian Aspiring Principal Assessment. Now, this is part of it's part of a plan or a system-wide approach to identify the readiness for aspiring principals in the state of Victoria. So essentially, if you're in the state system, you cannot apply for a principalship in a government school unless you have been assessed as being ready. And the assessment comprises those three components. There's a 360-degree feedback survey. You need to create a portfolio of practice and take part in an interview, which is a behaviourally standard interview. I think teachers from Catholic schools and independent schools can also be part of that. They can, but again, there's no obligation to do so. New South Wales, because as Bernie said, we have this, like the world over, shortage of principals. New South Wales have come up with this idea of fast-tracking top teachers to become principals. So if you're identified as being successful as a classroom teacher, you can be fast-tracked into a principal role, which can take up to 20 years, but you can be through in under 10 years. Now, it's a part of their school success model. It started in 2002. To date, we've had no feedback. Teachers and graduate teachers complete a fairly rigorous selection process, but what impact it's actually having on the quality of the principals, we don't know. So it's a bit of a watch this space. Thanks, Bernie. So again, with our research, we've tried to pin down, so what is the reality of principals' work? So for what are we preparing them? And there seem to be three key areas which we felt could almost be collapsed into one. But there are dilemmas at present, certainly with the aftermath of living with COVID. And we did some research through the International School Leaders Development Network last year. And we've got a book coming out shortly. But we interviewed 47 principals on living through and beyond the pandemic. So what impact has that aftermath of COVID had on them? One of the key things that we're seeing now in schools, as Bernie alluded to, is the staffing. There's just a desperate shortage of middle leaders, of senior leaders, and young leaders, young teachers coming into the profession that don't necessarily see it as this is my life work. Stress and burnout is huge. And again, we've given you some references there, but our experience with principals, the stress, the burnout, I've just had enough is sort of the story that we're hearing. So it's a high principal turnover, and attrition, people going into earlier retirement, and it simply is that amount of work that's being put on them. And I guess part of what they lived through with COVID, where they shouldered everything. They certainly did here. What we have is an Australian Principal Health and Wellbeing Survey, that the latest one in 2023 saw 1 in 3 principals flagged as being at risk of burnout or serious health issues. And the top 5 sources were surprisingly, not at all, the quantity of work, the lack of time to focus on the core business of learning because of all the administrative stuff, the teacher shortage, the mental health of students, which has been aggravated by our 2 years almost in lockdown. And also now we're really looking at mental health issues of staff. And these are the things, apart from this focus on compliance, which is just massive. So principals are seeing themselves spending their time on administrative stuff rather than on the business of learning. So that workload, and this is what we've pointed out there, it's that pressure to meet the targets, you know, whether they're academic targets, we keep hearing this all the time, but the deadlines, everything's got to be done by now, and the compliance for everything. Child safety is huge, workplace safety is huge. So it's that busyness. And our school leaders are reporting an average of 56.2 hours a week during term and 22 hours during school holidays. And that's an average. So there are many that are working much more than that. For all that, principals with whom you speak will say, it's a rewarding experience and I don't want to go leave it. So in some of our work with principals, these were just 3 things that they identified as being really important in terms of the preparation and why these things were important. That model the leader you want people to be. So that modeling of leadership practices, the building of capacity, and developing collective efficacy. And these are quotes from some of our principals who modeling leadership practices. Can we just flick back? Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, one said that their principal was someone who's very deliberately intentional where he spends his time, and he's quite intentionally showed me what to let go of. I describe his style of leadership as high autonomy, high trust, and high expectations. And these quotes came from people who had felt that they had been well mentored and supported by their principal and were now new principals. One of his greatest attributes was he never showed frustration with you. If you were off track, he would quietly and subtly speak with you, always maintaining your dignity, but bringing you back to where you should be. These were the practices this person perceived she'd learned. And then another one, when we talk about building capacity, she very much gives people the power and the authority to do what they need to do. She anoints people and gives them the power to see it through. So that autonomy, which is so important. Or he gave me a chance to do things I hadn't done before. I'm 1,000 times better having had those 6 years with him. I wouldn't nearly have been as ready for this principalship as I have after working with him. And then finally, the collective efficacy. He puts a lot of belief in other people. She ignites something further for you to go and do, not just distributes, but plants an idea and gives you the freedom to run with that to a degree. And she's giving the next level down of leaders a lot of empowerment to make changes. So what do we make from all this? And we see we can have mandated and non-mandated approaches to preparation. And there are benefits and challenges for both. But that apprentice model relies heavily on the person themselves and their determination and motivation, but it also relies heavily on the leaders with whom they work that give them time and actually give them the opportunity to grow into leadership. So, and what we did see, what is success? How do we guarantee that success? And we've done heaps of research on successful school principalship, but there is no pattern. And what works in one school, we've learned doesn't work in another school. So we sort of really see that there are two aspects to principal preparation. There's the preparation, but then there's the development. It's that problem solving. It's how do we manage the people? How do we respond to those different challenging contexts, to the parents and the parent demands? At the same time, looking after oneself and coaching the new band of leaders and being part of peer networks. So I'm getting that support from my peers too, so that I continue as a leader, I continue to grow. So that's sort of really where we're at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Super interesting. We will quickly move on to the next presenter. So I'm happy to introduce Sergio Caldames from Chile, and he's sharing right away. Thank you so much.
Hi, Suzanne. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me today. Today is a special day for me. It's been 4 years to this day, almost precisely, that I became a doctor at the IOE UCL, and I was a little bit shocked because I just saw Tony Bush on the list, and you were part of my viva. So a little bit surprised, but I guess this is like a surprise party for me. So thank you very much, guys. You didn't need to, but thank you. Thank you for having this celebration for me and my anniversary. Before I start, just apologies because we here in Chile, I'm from University of Santiago, in Chile, south of the world, in the Latin American region, and we just get back from our summer break yesterday. So I'm very rusty. So again, sorry, apologies on front of this. I'm gonna when I had the invitation, I have a difficulty to wrap my mind around what I'm going to present today. So part of that is that we now in Chile, we are starting to discuss some of these issues. We're a little bit behind. We're doing a lot of things, but those things are not crystallized yet. So I'm going to show you today are a couple of things that I believe, this is a lot about my interpretation of the situation right now. Being an academic, working in professional development for more than a decade, and now running a program preparing school leaders in my university. So I'm going to show you a bit of the background. I want to show you, and it's impossible for me to discuss everything in this in just a little bit more than 10 minutes. But I'm going to jump into very quickly into when I put some of the challenges that I see for the professional development in our context. So the most important thing, and this is the most important thing to understand everything, is we as a country, we are named Chile. And some of you may think, yes, it's because of the Chile. And the answer is probably yes. Nobody knows. But I want to believe that we are named after this amazing food. So if you want to share that with your friends, like, yeah, I saw a presentation from a country that is named after a vegetable. I think it's fantastic. So please do it please do it if you can. But something about Chile, and you see it here more is that as a country, geographically, is a weird and challenging context. We are very narrow and very long. And not only that, but also still now, but especially before, we are very isolated from the world. In one side of the map, you have the Andes Mountains, and from the other side, you have the ocean. So it's very difficult to get to Chile. And that also has a lot to do with the challenges that we are experiencing now. Something to understand, again, it's impossible for me to summarize everything in just a few minutes, but a central point for us to understand most of the Chilean culture, and including education and leadership, is that we experienced a very long dictatorship. Last year, we remember the 50 years of the event. For us, it's also the 9/11. Yeah, was also a Tuesday, but it happened several decades before the Twin Towers attacked. But for us, 9/11 refers to a moment where we lost our democracy and we installed a army-led dictatorship. The dictatorship did many things, but one of the elements that I think is more relevant to discuss today is that they pretty much aim for destroy or weak, at least to weak the public education, the public sector across different fields, including schools. And one of the things I did for school leaders is that they appoint directly in all the public schools a person that was not a teacher, that was not somebody from education, but a person that was close to the dictatorship. So for decades, we got a principle that was set for life, that got zero accountability, and did whatever he or she wants. And sometimes that weirdly worked, but most of the times didn't. So they retire at the early 2000s, and due to age, most of these principals start retiring, and only then we start building a framework, a policy, an interest, allocated resources, and talking about what we can do to prepare, to guide, to build a national agenda for school leadership. And in Chile, I think it's not completely different from Australia and the presentation you just saw today, but we are roughly, in Chile, we have like 10,000 schools, roughly. We are a population of like 20 million, and we have 10,000 schools. Half of those schools are public school, or what you will call state-funded schools. They pretty much concentrated at the service of the most poor communities. And this is part of the challenges of Chile. Yeah, we have different systems for different people. Segregation is or cornerstone in a way. In 2011, so about a decade ago, we introduced, I think for me, one of the center efforts to a policy that aimed to reshape how we understand leaders and what is the importance we put into the principle. And the law is that you see there is a law, it's a 2005-01, introduced a selection process for the first time. Before that, as I said before, you have a principal for life. And when that person retired, every schools or every space district create a system to select a new principal. This law introduced a national standard, a national process. All schools has to advance through this system, and that allows to put more resources, that allows to put more higher standards of what we expect for principals. So we started like other way around. We put a great selection process, a more strict selection process, but we didn't put a lot of effort in preparing people for that selection process. So we are, in my mind, I know there's unfair what I'm saying, because we have done this little efforts for decades, but I think just for the last decade, we have put priority, we have prioritized leadership in our context. So if you are selected as a principal, you survive the process, you're selected, you sign a contract, a 5-year contract, and that's your term as a head teacher. And is that just the first principal was selected in 2012. And most schools in Chile, not all, but most schools in Chile have been participated in that. So today, most of the public schools in Chile will have a head teacher that was selected through this process. So different to the previous presentation, I'm going to give you now very briefly, a minute each, 7 challenges that I see today that are very important challenges to improve or to think or to address the professional development of school leaders. Firstly, in Chile, whereas you have some funding and you have some programs and you can apply, you can have some support that is minimal. Most of the efforts to prepare school leaders comes from people, individual people that want to study, they want to prepare themselves, they want to move forward. There is some funding, but it's not enough. And most of the people put their own money, put their own time, and put their own vision about where they're going after. It's highly decentralized at the level of individuals. So that presents initial challenge. There's frameworks, I will talk about that. You can do whatever you want. You got, even if you don't have, but most people had a graduate degree, but you pay for it. You do it in whatever place you want to do it, and then you use it in the way you can use it. Everything is, there's no alignment between the system. Secondly, I think Bernie and Helen spoke about this again before. It has to do with workload, and I'm going to jump into this in detail. I think everybody here understands what we're saying, but in the professional development perspective, this presents massive challenges because teachers in Chile and head teachers in Chile and everybody that works in schools in Chile work a lot. And for us in the university, it's impossible for us to introduce and to propose programs that are more aligned with the necessities of the people and the conditions of the people. So most programs in Chile are, I'm talking mostly about graduate programs, but they oftentimes are quite similar, like other systems or other experiences, but last a year or 2 years and are concentrated very intense in face-to-face interaction. So you have 2 years of for program. Every program is kind of similar. So when I just illustrate this, for us, we teach on Monday, Wednesday, Thursday from 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. And in the summer break and the winter break, we have intensive programs as well. You have to do it for 2 years. And that's very difficult. It's very difficult to teach, but it's very difficult to learn under those conditions for 2 years. And again, as I said before, when you finish, there's no guarantee that this degree will allows you to do anything. It's all the systems work in this alignment. And I think, Helen, you were talking about this before, something that is my actual project at the moment. I'm trying to understand retention. We have only a fraction of our principals or leaders or teachers stay in the same schools for a long time. And just for head teachers, where data is showing us that only 20% of the people that start leading a school end the term. Around 20% is lost every year. So for 100 head teachers that start a program, a term, where leading a school, only 20 finish that at the end of the year, at the end of the 5 years, ends in the same school, which presents some challenges when we're trying to target a specific professional development, because people move around a lot. Not only that, but they move around geographically a lot. So we have moments, and because the country is super long, it's quite common that you start a program and you move around, so you have to abandon the program, or you work in another place and the things that you learn not always help you in that place. And this is connecting what I said before. We don't have a career path for head teachers. If you want to do it, you can do it, but it's just like that. And Bernie, you show a little bit about the different stages, like teacher leaders, middle leaders. We have that as well, but it depends a lot of the capacity, the creativity, the conditions of different schools. But from a formal perspective, you don't have that recognition at the level that you want to expect. So for us, most of our students are teachers, and they want to be head teachers immediately after this. And many apply and get the job. But for us, it's very difficult to provide different preparations for different stages of development of our participants. This is different, but it's something that is something that keeps me awake at night, and something that I'm working at the moment with my colleague Natalia Ferrada, is that for the first time, Chile is experienced massive migration. Yeah, and I left Chile in the 2015, and most Chileans, more people in the street look like me. I know, very beautiful, I know, look like me. And when I returned in 2020, Chile looked completely different colors, different accents, different languages, different food. And that came with a lot of new families, new students, and it's something really, really nice. And now, and we changed completely in a few years, but landscapes present massive challenges for teachers, massive challenges for principals, but also for professional development. Not only that we don't have any device, a policy aiming to do this, to prepare an international head teacher or a principal. At our communities in Chile, most of the students are migrant students. But as a head teacher, there's many challenges to hire an international teacher. So many of our students or our partners are asking us, like, can you provide some guidelines for us to help us to lead this diverse community? Because we don't have nothing yet. We're very behind on this challenge. Yeah, almost ending my presentation. One of the things that we have, I think it's same as the previous presentation also did this, is that we have many instruments, many tools, frameworks, guidelines, but they don't usually talk to each other. So we have a framework very similar to the Australian one. And I remember because I did a paper about that when I was younger. But you can use it, or maybe you don't want to use it. Maybe you want to use the other one. Maybe you want to use your own. And that's don't always talk this system, this language, this good practices. They're not aligned. They're not connected with assessment. They're not connected with promotions or anything. At the same time, we have many institutions that work directly with head teachers and school leaders. Again, they don't necessarily talk to each other. So on a Monday, you have a visit from the superintendency. On a Tuesday, from the agency of quality that's similar to Ofsted. Somebody from the ministry can visit you on a Wednesday, and somebody from the district can visit you on a Friday. And you have that all the same week, asking you, demanding you for different levels of accountability process, and maybe and you as a head teacher, you're not prepared to deal with different stakeholders. Finally, we are now in a big reform at district level. It's been a few years now, and it would last a few years more. And before this, and still is working like that, municipalities, Department of Education, and each municipality, which is like a city, runs the schools. And now we have a new system here. And this introduction of the system has shown us many challenges, both in terms of policy, but also in terms of professional development. It's not only to prepare them, the head teachers, the principals, school leaders, but also to prepare the system, this new tier at the middle, that it will present new challenges for us for decades now. So in summary, we are in a new country in this. We have done a lot of things. I think this is not something that just started this year. We've been working on this, but many challenges for us and for our community in terms of professional development will arise now. We moved from this very initial stage to a more intermediate stage of creating a sense of alignment between these different devices, policies, and practices, but also us from the university, how we prepare our school leaders in this chaotic environment to face the challenges that are different in different parts of the country and are different in different moments of the life of each school leader. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Using my actual hands, not the ones in Zoom. It was very interesting. I already have questions. So then I would like to go on to our next presenter. It's Catherine Schiffman. Now we're moving on to the north, the States. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you for including me on this panel. My name is Kathy Schiffman. I am a professor at Shenandoah University in Virginia, and I am the program coordinator for our Doctor of Education and Educational Leadership program. And I recently joined BELMAS, and I'm particularly excited about being part of this group because I'm interested in gathering ideas from around the world. Okay, so the States, we are, let's see, okay. We're complex, or we think we are. Education is primarily a state and local responsibility. We have 50 states and we have territories. So each of those entities have different education systems. The national governance is, depending on your perspective, is less influential. The national government contributes 8% of funding to schools. However, the national government takes leadership in gathering research, disseminating, as well as funding programs to ensure equity and access, as well as many local schools and states would say issuing a fair number of mandates. But it's a very complex system. And so within that, we have our non-governmental actors are also very important. We have professional associations that are sort of gathering best practices around the country. So we have an association for secondary school principals, for elementary school principals. We have an association for chief state school officers, as well as preparation. Accrediting bodies are also critical in our country in terms of accreditation, particularly in higher education, in order to offer a program. These are bodies of member organizations who decide on what constitutes standards for accrediting a program. We also have foundations that are playing a role here in contributing money towards particular initiatives or projects, and then a host of other non- and for-profit organizations. So variation is the name of the game, I think. We're big in terms of public schools. We have, so those are our governmental public schools. We have close to 50 million students. We also have public charter schools. So those are our schools of choice. They're still government funded, but these schools have more flexibility in what kinds of programs they can offer, hiring, et cetera. And again, what a charter school is varies by state. So we have about a little over 3.5 million there. And then our private schools constitute a much smaller proportion of our enrollment. It's about close to 5 million. We don't do well on preschool. In 2021, only 50% were enrolled for 3 to 4. And it wasn't just COVID, because if you look at 2019, only 54%. Homeschooling is also a part of the landscape. And again, the rules vary by state, but about 5.5% of children are homeschooled by their parents. Our localities are typically school districts, and the school districts are typically there's a school board overseeing the school district, and those school boards may be elected or appointed. So we have over 13,000 public school districts for our government-funded schools, and then within that, close to 100,000 public schools. And then you can see our private schools at about 30,000. And that's a mix of religious and other independent schools. We're a very diverse society, and increasingly so. What you can see here is that the US student enrollment is no longer majority white, non-Hispanic. The largest increase in ethnicity we're seeing is in the Hispanic category. Across both public and private schools, the poverty rate is 17% for all children. And then within public schools, we have about 10% who are English learners. And then student with disabilities, about 15%. Okay, so who's a principal in the US? Taking a national snapshot. What you can see here is fairly similar years of experience as a principal in the public and private sphere, maybe a few more 20 plus years in the private school. Our principals are the head of the school. Statistically, we are majority female as well as white, non-Hispanic. And what that means is we have a lack of representation between what our student demographics look like and what our leadership looks like. In terms of education, you can see there tends to be higher education levels for public school principals, particularly at the education specialist level, which is a step up from the master's. Our requirements for ed leadership preparation and ed leadership roles just varies across the states. So the Education Commission of the States did a study recently looking at finding that 47 states do have leadership standards. Principal preparation programs have to align with those state or national standards in all 50 states. The majority of states require an internship component of the preparation. There's a smaller group of states that have an alternative route to initial certification or initial licensure. And then at least 8 states have an assistant principal certification requirement. So the profession standards represent the coming together of associations for practicing principals. So the National Association of Secondary School Principals, elementary school principals, AASA, the superintendents, with the association that oversees the state education leaders, the Council of Chief State School Officers, as well as the 2 associations representing professional preparation in ed leadership. So University Council for Education Administration and the International Council for Professors of Educational Leadership. In 2015, the professional standards for education leaders that's in your left-hand column, were approved. And these, again, were reflecting what the profession believes are what we should be able to see in terms of knowledge and skills in a practicing principal, a practicing administrator. On the right-hand side, you see the National Educational Leadership Preparation Program standards, and these represent what a novice leader should should know and be able to do upon graduating from a program. So you can see there's a fair amount of alignment between these standards. There are some differences because, among other reasons, the NELP standards also had to comply with our professional accreditor, CAPE, and so we had to fit into CAPE's framework for developing standards as well. So these standards were, the PESL were approved in 2015. They are the former ISLIC standards for those who are familiar with the US system. And then the NELP standards were approved in 2018. Not all states adopted these by any means, but they provided guidance for states developing standards. There's a licensure exam that many states require aspiring principals to pass. That is aligned with the PESL. And let's see if I want to add anything else here. I guess that's good. Okay, so this is a product of the National Policy Board for Educational Administration. So I'll talk a little bit about my state, Virginia. And there are a few different routes to becoming a principal or obtaining your license. The traditional route, and the one most widely used, is that you have to have a master's degree from a regionally accredited college or university. So notice again the accreditation component here, that all universities need to be accredited by a regional accreditor, and that's different from CAPE. You need a minimum of 3 years of successful full-time teaching experience in either a public school, so a government school, or an accredited non-public school in an instructional position. And you need to complete an approved program in administration supervision from a regionally accredited college or university. So there are 21 Virginia universities that have approval, including Shenandoah. As part of that preparation, you need to complete 320 hours of a practicum or internship. 120 of those can be completed as part of your coursework. And in addition, and then the additional are made up elsewhere. And the idea here is that those should be fairly, you should have a variety of experiences at different levels of the system. And then you need to pass the school leader's licensure assessment that the Virginia Board of Education has prescribed. So in that case, it is the SLLA, which is the one that is aligned with those principal standards for educational leaders. I guess, and there is a process for reciprocity. Out-of-state applicants are required to hold a valid comparable certificate issued by another state, and they must also hold a master's degree from a regionally accredited college or university, 3 years of successful full-time instructional experience. So what does that mean for the university-based preparation environment? Our typical students are attending class part-time, typically in the evenings, working full-time, predominantly as educators. We have to accommodate that, and we're still trying to figure out what works best post-COVID. Program delivery is a combination of online, in-person, or some hybrid version of that. Instruction may be asynchronous or synchronous. And then what's a course? That's something we're trying to figure out. Traditionally, we've had a 15-week semester, but increasingly programs, including ours, are going to 7 to 8 week courses. And it's a competitive environment. A lot of different programs are offering leadership preparation, and We collaborate, but we also compete with one another around the state and with programs outside the state, particularly when you have the online component. In terms of ongoing professional learning, I think this is an area where there's increasing recognition of a need for it. There's some topic, but that takes money. There's topic focus types of professional learning, such as suicide prevention. Some states and localities are developing leadership academies to support support ongoing professional learning for principals, and then coaching and mentoring. But this is an area that is very sort of spotty. It's happening in some places, not in others. There were federal funds following the COVID funds that have been used to provide some additional professional learning in districts, but those funds are drying up. So what are some issues? And it's been really, I don't know, discouraging or interesting to see that these are pretty similar across the presentation so far. Stress is intense. The workload is intense. The average workload from a recent survey was about over 60 hours per week. More time spent on administrative tasks than teaching and learning, and any other time. In the US, it's also a really volatile climate, political climate, cultural climate that principals have been sort of in the middle of, both in terms of the COVID and the masking issues, as well as things related to what's in the curriculum, and it's been a tough few years, and I think that's going to continue. Also, a lot of concern around social emotional health that came up elsewhere for students, staff, and leaders. A recent survey by the National Association of Secondary School Principals found that about 50% of principals were considering retiring or changing careers within the next couple of years. So there's a real concern going forward that we're going to see some shortages and a lot of turnover. And as others have alluded to, the research is overwhelmingly shows the importance of stable leadership and strong leadership in student outcomes, school climate, teacher retention. So that's a major concern. As I alluded to, leadership does not reflect our student demographics. That's improving on the teaching side, still more room for improvement, but it's even more so on the leadership side. I think 77% of our school leaders are white, versus a 45% white student population. There's been attention on strengthening the principal pipeline. The Wallace Foundation has been very active in this. How do we strengthen standards? We have standards now. Looking at preparation, how do we strengthen preparation? We need to be thinking more carefully about selection and hiring, and then evaluating. And then, as I mentioned, how can we provide support and continued professional learning? How can we free administrators up to have that professional learning when they have pretty demanding workloads? And I will stop there.
Thank you so much. It's so interesting to hear the different contexts. As you said, Kathy, we can recognize each other in the different contexts. So we're moving on to the fourth presenter. Paul is ready. Thank you so much, Paul. You can start whenever you want to.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. Nice to see you, and nice to see so many familiar faces as well. I can see some friends and colleagues that I've just seen a few weeks ago in Dublin, which is great, and some that I see regularly at Belmas as well. It's not actually quite my Viva anniversary or anything like that, similar to Sergio, but it's nice to see Deb as well, who's one of my Viva examiners, coincidentally as well, but a good friend from Belmas too. So it's a real pleasure to be with you all. I'm joining you from the beautiful Hong Kong. I'm not joining you exactly from this beautiful campus because it's also just about 9:10 in the evening. And if you can believe me, it's also freezing cold in Hong Kong just now. And anybody that knows Hong Kong, below 20 degrees is freezing. My hands are currently turning blue, but still delighted to be with you as well. I'm not joining you from this campus either. I'm in another part of Hong Kong, and you'll be forgiven if you think that this presentation I'm sharing with you is just a selection of great photography of the beautiful skyline of Hong Kong. And it is kind of that, but there are some important points, hopefully, I'm going to share about leadership preparation and development within the Hong Kong system. So I'm really looking forward to sharing some of this and being able to discuss this with you as well. And I'm just going to assure Suzanne and colleagues that I've got the timer sitting in front of me to make sure I stick to it as best as possible. So many of you may know the Hong Kong context, but one of the points that I think I would start off by saying is that, number one, I'm going to be focusing on the public system in Hong Kong. I've spent just about 6.5 years, nearly 7 years in Hong Kong, so just about a permanent resident, predominantly in the international school system as a vice principal and as a teacher before that. And I've just moved to join the Education University back in August this year. But the international school context is also a very interesting context in Hong Kong, which I think would warrant some other exploration. But today I'm going to focus on the public system in particular. So Hong Kong, you may know, is a special administrative region of the People's Republic of China. And with that comes its own governance arrangements and its own education system as well. Very interesting historical context with a period of colonial rule by the British and then past 1997. An interesting context again with some of the aftermath of that, but then of course some of the contemporary forces of globalization that we see influencing education policy development across the territory, across the special administrative region. Now you can see some statistics on the screen which I won't spend too much time on, but I think some important points to highlight is that within the kind of governance and legislative context of Hong Kong as a special administrative region, we have our own Education Bureau, which oversees policy development, the kind of legislative context of education provision within Hong Kong. And that's supported by some other kind of non-departmental public bodies, as well as some other government agencies that not only support the work of schools, but importantly support kind of the teacher education infrastructure, as well as leadership development and preparation as well. One of them being the Committee of Teachers and Principals, which focuses kind of on the education and qualifications of the teaching profession, as well as the Education Bureau itself and some of the sectors and departments within the Bureau, which focus on professional learning and development, the articulation of standards. And from these organisations, we've seen the development of some of the things that you would recognise from other systems and some of the things that have been discussed already, like the professional standards frameworks for teachers and principals. We've seen a professional ladder which articulates career progression pathways and the associated leadership development that has to go with that. And what's been very interesting is that actually sitting alongside this has been a legislated amount of time that should be dedicated to professional learning and development for all members of the teaching profession, including to access career progression and other forms of leadership development. And that can vary depending on your role from between 90 to 150 hours. And for some that might be within a year, and some that can span over a 3-year period. And what's interesting is this is actually relatively high in comparison to most OECD countries, but it's actually less than some other Asian societies in the region as well, which I think is an interesting and important point. Now, in terms of kind of elaborating a bit further on the context, but I do kind of want to go a little bit quicker here, but one important thing to note is the implications of the kind of varied and in some cases messy governance system within the Hong Kong context, and the implications that has not only for how leaders practice, but what leadership development preparation programs actually do to prepare and support leaders as well. There's 3 major school types. 2 of these you can call government or aided school, both of which get funding from the government and have school sponsoring bodies, which may be the Education Bureau themselves, so it could be charitable or religious organisations. And I'll elaborate a little bit in a second on what that means and the implications for leaders as well. Another example is a directly subsidised school, where they're receiving some funds directly from the government, but they're operated by their own management committees, as well as increased autonomy that they're able to exercise over curriculum, assessment, and other policy that goes alongside that as well. So some of these elements you might recognise as some similarities to what Bernie and to what Helen have shared, but also you might recognise to things like the Academies programme or multi-academy trusts in England, and also charter schools in the United States as well. So some interesting similarities, but very important implications for the governance system within Hong Kong. So to summarize that, what leaders are navigating in terms of not just how they lead, but in terms of how they understand their role and their ability to exercise agency within this relatively complex system, is that we've got the Education Bureau, which very much has oversight of the legislative context of schools and resource allocation, etc. But in some cases, you've also got the school sponsoring bodies. These, again, as I said before, could be charitable organizations. In many cases, they're religious organizations, and they're setting the vision, the mission of schools. They have a say in kind of the performance management, as well as some of the aspects of human resources as well, in terms of the recruitment of principals and senior leaders too. And these school sponsoring bodies can sometimes be comprised of, we've got about 15 school sponsoring bodies in Hong Kong, which are leading more than 10 to 15 schools within their group, whereas some can just be supporting one. The Education University of Hong Kong is a school sponsoring body with one primary school that happens to be on the campus of the university. But importantly, what all schools have are incorporated management committees. These management committees will have representation from the school community as well as the broader community as well, similar to a school board or a governing board or board of governors, etc. And they have some of the typical functions we might expect from these sorts of board of governors that kind of span from school policies as well as some of the more specific elements of how human resources and finance is being managed. But ultimately, they also still answer to the school sponsoring body and to the Education Bureau themselves as well. But what I think is important to highlight in terms of the first point around leadership preparation and development is that it is a very complex, and some might describe it as a messy policy space. And with that in mind, one of the first things that EDB, the Education Bureau, offer is a suite of professional learning resources which focus on coming to understand the various layers and components of the governance arrangements within the system. Now, calling them a profession or a suite of professional learning may be a bit of a stretch, but what that helpfully does is actually articulate what each of the components are, the associated documents that sit alongside that, but some video explanations in Cantonese and in English to support leaders and others within these communities to understand what the expectations are. But I think what's important to kind of start to summarize in terms of what this all means and what it means for Hong Kong as a system. And what I'll say here as well is that I showed you a picture at the start of where I work. This picture here is about a 5-minute walk in that direction. So a really beautiful part of Hong Kong as well. But what I want to highlight here actually is the fact that Hong Kong is kind of trying to negotiate just now, obviously the fact that it's had this history as kind of a key global financial center, which has been changing in recent years, but they're still trying to maintain that. But given this balance of influence of East and West, and it's presumed to be this kind of excellent and ideal melting pot for some excellent innovation and different ideas of what we could be doing for a system. But what I think has actually come out is the fact that given this period of kind of post-colonial rule, the contemporary forces of globalization, we're seeing some of the familiar, recognizable features of a neoliberal culture influencing policy development and education reform that's happened in the territory over particularly the last 21 years, but what we can see since 1997 in the handover as well. And I think that what comes from that is this reliance on blueprints or recipes that we see in other systems, thinking that this is a component that's necessary for system development, but questions about how well does that actually reflect the needs within Hong Kong society, as well as how that reflects what we know about what school leaders are facing within the territory as well. So to support this and to kind of support how we both understand, but also support leaders in leadership preparation and development, there's a huge range of kind of professional learning opportunities, but a professional learning infrastructure that exists within the territory. One of those being obviously the universities. I obviously work at Education University of Hong Kong, and sitting within the university and within the Faculty of Education and Human Development is a centre that some of you will recognise, the Asia Pacific Centre for Leadership and Change. The Education Bureau give the authority to centres like this one, as well as the university system as well, to offer professional development programmes, as well as particular principalship preparation programmes as well. to support new leaders applying for roles, but also while they're in these new roles as well. So very much this is relying on the university infrastructure across the territory, as well as organisations like the Hong Kong Principals Institute, which support that, and also is a reciprocal relationship, I guess, in terms of the work they do, but also the work that they then support universities to do in leadership development on an ongoing basis as well. So you may be thinking, well, what does that actually look like, and what are the implications of what this looks like? And I guess to start with, this is the professional ladder that has been articulated by COTAP and the EDB, trying to articulate what role the professional standards should play, but also how they envisage career development in the teaching profession in Hong Kong. And we could spend time, and I would actually quite like to spend time, thinking about the vocabulary choice on here. So we think about the articulation of middle managers and then the move to vice principals and principals. We think about this idea of visionary edupreneurs is what we're expecting of principals. Or we think about inspirational co-constructors or role models, etc. There's a lot of vocabulary choices in here which could have some interesting implications or some inferences that we can make from that, which we can't address today, but I think is a worthwhile conversation. But I think what's worth highlighting is that this heavy emphasis on the transition from being a teacher to middle leadership roles, in particular named position of middle leadership roles, onto a vice principalship and onto a principalship, it's very much relying on, first of all, an articulation of the competencies that are expected at each of these stages. There's a heavy and an increasing emphasis on these ideas of values and conduct in particular, but also an interesting articulation, I think, on a focus on self-advancement and then that connection to self-reflection. And the concept of self-advancement, I think, is one that would be worthwhile breaking down as well. But to summarize, this is how they're articulating it. And I think what's an interesting point here is that I guess the dialogue and the narrative that sits around this policy development around the professional ladder, heavily emphasizing these named positions of leadership and perhaps missing an articulation of what we might come to understand as forms of teacher leadership or non-positional roles of leadership that could still be being exercised in different ways. So in terms of what that looks like in terms of particular leadership development and preparation programs, as I mentioned, there's a heavy emphasis on expectation for transition from a teaching role into a named position of leadership. And in 2020, there was new requirements put in place for core professional learning programs that had to be engaged with, which my own university and myself and colleagues will contribute to, as well as elective opportunities to engage in professional learning. What's I think really important to highlight here is that this is also kind of split up and can be dependent on the seniority you might have in your current role or what the technical next role might be on the professional ladder and on the pay scale for you to be engaging with. The code elements you can see on the screen here are things you might recognize from similar programs in other countries as well. So looking at conduct and values, policy, what it means to be a school leader, what that practice looks like. And then as you move into more senior roles, a heavier emphasis on specifics of school administration and management, which comprise financial and human resources at times as well. But what's important is these core elements have been approved and developed by the Education Bureau. Universities have won a tender to be able to offer these programs. The elective elements can also be offered by universities if they set up these programs, the professional development programs, but these have to be agreed on by the school sponsoring body or the Incorporated Management Committee, and broadly speaking, would have to be approved by the Education Bureau as being related to leadership development in particular. Now, a similar thing actually applies for principals as well, and we can see some of the kind of similarities, particularly you can see here, some of you know the Scottish system. We see here, for example, the breakdown of professional learning programs and certification programs for aspiring principals, for newly appointed principals, and for serving principals, which sounds quite similar to Scotland's into headship, in headship, and excellence in headship, for example. But what's I think important here is that there's very strict requirements in terms of who is actually able to engage with these programs, in terms of the expectation on how many years service that you've had. You have to complete these programs within a 2-year period. They're only valid for a 5-year period after that. And you can see represented briefly in the diagram here what the kind of expectation would be then if your certification expires after that. And what I think is interesting as well is this expectation in terms of hour allocation and forms of professional learning doesn't end after achieving this certification for principalship. but these expectations remain for serving principals as well, with some broader articulation around kind of service to education and to the broader community as well. Now, that's what it looks like in terms of possibility, or in terms of what's expected of leadership preparation and development in the policy context around that. But that doesn't mean that it all works and functions exactly as laid out. And surprise, surprise, it absolutely doesn't do that. But what's interesting about the context we're facing now, not just in the context of Hong Kong, but I think in the field of educational leadership, and particularly as we examine leadership preparation and development, is there isn't a huge amount of literature examining this, or empirical work being done examining this within the Hong Kong system in recent years in particular. But what's still happening is that with the form that governance arrangements take, so with school-based management, which is kind of the broader overarching term to refer to what incorporated management committees do and the role of the principal, is that there might appear to be high levels of autonomy for principals and school management committees, but there is still a high level of accountability in place within the system, which breeds many forms of compliance. So with that, the attractiveness of that role, sometimes we have to question in terms of who actually wants to become a principal in the Hong Kong system. And with that, the colleagues at the Education University who have examined this in recent years have identified that even with these rigorous approaches to leadership preparation and development and the programs that sit alongside it, there's still gaps in what principals are identifying they would like to have explored prior to taking on a principalship and during as well. Things you can see here like legal matters, human resource management, and financial management. But despite that, what I think is a really important point to highlight here is the fact that the principals that participated in this study after completing the certification for principalship, they were still not treating it as a short-term task or a stepping stone onto another senior post. This was a job they committed to and they wanted to stay in it, and they were concerned about the preparation that went along that. And just to conclude very, very briefly, I know I've only got about a minute to go, is that there's other demands, not just on leadership development, but there's other demands about simply being in the school system in Hong Kong. We've talked about already in other systems around the serious concerns around mental health and well-being, and that's a huge factor in Hong Kong and has historically, which I don't think has been sufficiently addressed yet. Ideas which many of you may know about, but we could talk about a little bit further at another point, about this idea of academic rationalism. So how we understand and expect what the experience in a school system should be and what the outcomes of that should look like, heavily favouring standardised forms of assessment and pedagogical approaches that reflect that. But what we're also seeing is an increased diversity in the student population, as well as the population of Hong Kong, but also simultaneously shifting social attitudes and serious issues with equity that might not actually reflect that. And ultimately, we're also seeing a decreasing school-age population, which has serious consequences for principals managing potential imminent closures of their schools as well, depending on the state of their roles too. So I think what we have to start asking and thinking about within the Hong Kong system is not just how well prepared teachers and school leaders are to take on different forms of leadership and also potentially a principalship, but actually thinking about how do we give place and space for teachers and leaders to have a more agentic role within the system, to think about not just these typical and traditional paths to leadership and to seeking leadership in particular, but what varied career paths might look like, varied roles might look like, and how the professional learning that our teachers and leaders are engaging in can better reflect the complexity of the Hong Kong system. So some of the questions I'm posing is how do we actually reflect that, come to understand it? How do we utilise the extensive histories and experiences of those in the system and those coming into the system to help us understand better what leadership preparation and development should mean and should look like within the Hong Kong system? But ultimately, what I think is important to analyse on a broader systemic level is actually how this unique melting pot that many people understand Hong Kong to be, what that might mean for how we understand professional learning, understand leadership, how we understand this serious tension between the contemporary forces of globalization and Hong Kong trying to navigate its future as a special administrative region of the People's Republic of China. And so we're trying to do that in the context of the Education University in Hong Kong. A really important study that we've just started this year is looking at organizational ambidexterity in Chinese context. So building a data set, primarily focusing on how principals utilize knowledge that exists within their school, but beyond their school system, in the pursuit of improvement and change and supporting their own professional learning. So look out for some of the work that we're doing on that. If you want to engage further, there'll be some future publications. You'll be able to access that through the links on the screen. And please do keep in touch. I'm sorry that I'm about, I think, 1 minute or 2 minutes 40 over time, but thanks for your time. There's some references that we'll share with you at the end as well. And looking forward to the discussion about the Hong Kong context for leadership preparation and development. Thanks, Suzanne.
Thank you very much, Paul. On behalf of Deb and Suzanne and myself, before we move on to the next part, I just want to thank again our panelists. So Helen, Sergio, Kathy and Paul, thank you so much for your contributions, your insights, and for feeding us really with such an important topic. So we're incredibly lucky and really very excited to have with us as our discussant tonight here, because it's just after midnight in Melbourne. Professor Jing Gu, Professor of Leadership in Education, and Director of the UCL Centre for Educational Leadership in London. Jing, thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Suzanne and Deb, for inviting me to give me the opportunity. I'm feeling actually quite nervous because I was really excited to read and listen to all the presentations. They're just so insightful, you know, presenting a lot of really rich knowledge and insights about leadership and leadership preparation and development. And I'm also feeling quite nervous because I think sitting in the university now, our centre really leads, is the only university-based place to, it's a huge responsibility, I think, as academics to look into the research and evidence and understand and think about how we can do our job better to help our school leaders to learn and enjoy their learning better. I think that is simply our role. So my presentation is very much from that perspective, really, you know, through listening to these wonderful 4 presentations, and also the kind of lessons we have learned through working with almost 4,000 schools across England, doing these leadership development programs from middle leaders, subject leaders, all the way to executive leaders. So I've prepared a few slides. I will be precise. I'm sure people would have a lot of questions you want to ask presenters. So I think from what I have heard, this is almost a given now. We know leadership matters, and that's why all of us are sitting here, you know, spending lunchtime or not going to bed, listening to and sharing our insights about, you know, how given knowledge that we wanted to help our school leaders to enjoy what they do, the differences they make better. And from just pulling through all the 4 presentations, we have heard about the context, you know, the importance of context in relation to leadership and also leadership impact. We know that in many ways, you know, I know even in England, our programs have a kind of a session around leadership values, but I always take the view, as I've spoken with so many school leaders in the system, those kind of leadership values, moral purpose is a given. They, you know, if we look into the research evidence, why leaders, teachers become these professionals doing a really hard job because they want to make a difference. And the context, therefore, matters. However, you know, I think one of the things COVID has really taught us, as we have seen from many UNESCO World Bank reports, I loved one of the reports called the COVID virus, inequality virus. It hasn't really taught us anything new, but if anything, it kind of amplified the kind of challenges that's actually not new. Taking policy as an example, we have heard throughout the presentations, this is the policy context that our school leaders face. And the other thing that is not new is if we talk about the education quality and inequality equity, the fundamental social, cultural, and the cultural and economic factors that influence education inequality. You know, we can trace back to centuries old. Every time I look at picture, I think about Oliver Twist, you know, the East London, those kind of, and nowadays we're facing COVID has showed us again why those children in the socioeconomically deprived communities, rural communities in England, for example, coastal areas, they are those who are so lag behind, the kind of learning shock that we have, or most of us have written about. However, the difference, as colleagues have all highlighted through their presentations, is the pace, is the complexity, and it's the intensity of the challenges that our school leaders are facing these days. And I've just listed 5 things that are quite common throughout the issues around mental health and well-being in our schools, moral dilemmas about whether I should stay to do the job I believe in, or whether I should leave because I've really lost my heart in education, and the increased diverse community, teacher shortage, turnover issues. I put work and load, I split them. And this is what we're exploring in our current research. And depends on, I think this is where fascinates us in our research, looking into the impacts of national qualifications of school leadership. Our participants, it's just wonderful. We have built in this research opportunity, also look at the early career teachers. It's almost not new when we ask our school leaders, the work is hard, the workload is heavy, but are you thinking of leaving? A lot of them actually say they want to stay. And depends on how you ask the questions. It doesn't mean the work is not hard, but is it anything that's, especially if we think about leadership development, we could capture the positive energy. I think it was a Hong Kong colleague, Paul, mentioned about the agentic role of our teacher and school leaders to capture that agency, and then work with the system to create what I will say later on is that learning community, the collective intelligence that enable our leaders to actually stay in the profession. We also have, it was wonderful to hear all 4 papers talked about leadership standards. Because in England, we also have 10 standards. It's very similar to the Australian and the USA standards. But I think the challenge is certainly for leadership development is how we join the dots and how we connect conceptually the 10 standards into something, into a coherent learning program that our school leaders are able to join the dots and enact the learning in context that makes a difference. So what really made me think is, and this is also we're trying to capture in our own work about the international professional qualifications for school leaders, is how we help our leaders to capture the complexity which all the 4 papers have mentioned. And certainly in England, where I feel more confident talking about, there are so many leadership programs. And in the English system, we the leadership preparation and especially development tend to be done in schools. But we've also heard, in the USA, Hong Kong, and Chile, you have different models. In Australia, tend to be more university based. And the list we have seen, is wonderful to hear. We also see the synergy across these countries. We've seen leadership programs focusing on knowledge, the skills, the conduct, as Paul also listed, and the competence-based models. But what really challenges us is, how do you teach trust? And how do you teach building relationships? And those kind of the lateral approach, the more horizontal approach of teaching sections, does it serve the purpose of helping our school leaders to capture in their learning, through the enactments of the learning, understanding how their practices, the enactments of their knowledge, skills, and competencies actually influencing different aspects of school improvement processes. And we found that was really important and the key. In a way, I will address that later. I smiled when I looked at, with no preference at all in terms of I liked the Australian paper. It just is so similar. I will see this is what the English standards we have used. We also have on the left-hand side, there are the 10 leadership practices, very similar to, I loved the way the Australians kind of put the knowledge, vision, and values, they are the given, they are the foundation for the practices to be enacted. And that's how we, in our own leadership programs, kind of thinking about conceptually how we capture the interaction between the knowledge, skills, the values, as well as the practices. And beyond that, the impact across the phases, the improvements, school improvement processes to finally improve the student learning. Because at the heart of the thinking is not the leaders, it's the students. If we put students at the heart of any debate around teacher retention, around the leadership preparation and retention, sometimes you come to different conclusions. So just some final thoughts, really kind of enlightened by these 4 papers, really thinking about what it means for us as academics to think about developing leaders in the times of change. And we have a conceptual challenge about, given the isolation of the leaders of the schools, and we talked about in the English system, we have multi-academy trusts, but still, how we could enact learning using the social learning theory to underpin our programs, and really take seriously about how we foster the collective intelligence of a learning network that really help our leaders. So developing the leader, the person in the professional and through their practice. And I think that is something to make, then that takes me to think about the second bullet points is around how we help our leaders to enact the leadership learning. And what is really important that we have certainly been trying to do in UCL is to connect the theory with the practice through teacher inquiry based. Now we have developed a leader inquiry module, leader inquiry approach cut across all the different modules to really make the learning situated and impactful. And taken account, considering what I mentioned earlier about capturing the complexity, what is really important, what we wanted to explore, I think it's through the pedagogy to enable our leaders, not just to think about the competencies, think about the skills, but more importantly, to see the systems, to understand what works for whom, under what conditions, and learn their way through improvements, to really enact and provide the pedagogy and the structure of the learning network to enable that to happen. And I can't emphasize strongly enough about the importance of stronger and more creative school-university partnerships in that space to nurture our future leaders. So it's not just about learning the theory. And what I didn't hear, forgive me if I missed it, is the missing link about the recent kind of studies and evidence is really pointing to the importance of personal leadership resources and the dispositions and how they impact our school leaders' practice to build relationships, to develop people in their school, and more importantly, the concepts around being optimistic and understanding about leadership, self-efficacy and collective efficacy to enable our leaders to focus on the enablement, which is, given all the challenges that they all face, at the end of the day, children go to school and we do want more agentic leaders using Paul's language in our schools to make a difference. And forgive me, I just wanted to share what I meant about how we ask the questions about the work and the load. It is not necessarily just the time that leaders spend, and we're just about to publish a report in a couple of weeks' time in UCL, and we explored the concepts of work and load by asking different questions in a survey. So when you ask them about what drives them so this is just a survey based on participants in our national professional qualifications for specialists and also for head teachers. You can see a very, very positive picture about what the enthusiasm. I think what is often missing in our debate is losing sight of what actually drives our teachers and school leaders to make a difference. But then when you ask about their workload at the bottom, at the left corner, the 50% of the leaders, have told us it is hard, the workload is hard, and 10% said it's unrealistic. But then if you ask a different question about to what extent your workload is meaningful, rewarding, I think, on the right-hand side, that tells you a very different picture. I think it is, as academics, I'm going to come out now, so it is how we provides a much more coherent and a holistic understanding about the profession, about leaders, and about leadership, and then apply that into our efforts to continue to grow our leaders for the future of education. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ching. I think you've really captured, I think, the individualistic, knowledge of each of the four presentations, but also put it under an umbrella of some of the similarities and challenges and tensions that we're all facing in so many ways. I think I also want to thank you for provoking us really with that missing link. I think it's an important one that we have to think about. Certainly we're doing the work. I was just thinking, Helen, about the paper that we're doing about that modelling that we talk about as